Thank you all for coming today. It's an honor to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Klopp. She's the director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development at Columbia University. Dr. Klopp research delves into the complex issues of transportation, land use, and the politics of infrastructure, with a particular emphasis on Africa, with implications that resonate worldwide. Her most recent work involves leading the Partnership of Research on Informal and Shared Mobility, funded by the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations. This partnership brings together research centers from across the world to learn together about the unregulated and privately provided modes of transportation that are often the lifeline of cities in the Global South and that Jackie calls popular transport. Dr. Klopp is also a founding member of the award-winning Digital Matatus project, which produced the first open transit data for Nairobi's minibus transit system. This groundbreaking project set the standard for similar efforts worldwide, including initiatives to map informal transportation across Africa and Latin America to foster better transportation planning, research, and accountability. Dr. Klopp is also a core member of the Clean Air Toolbox for Cities, an interdisciplinary network center at Columbia University that aims to support cities with research on air pollution, climate change, and climate justice. Dr. Klopp is also a well-regarded mentor. I consider her one of the most influential figures in transportation planning and international development today. In fact, in recognition of her contributions, the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development named her one of the remarkable women in transport in 2021. Dr. Klopp earned her Bachelor's of Art in Physics from Harvard University and her PhD in Political Science from McGill University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacqueline Klopp to the Baumer Lecture.
Wow, thanks so much, Professor Santana. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. So today I'm going to talk to you about what I call popular transport, digital commons, and decarbonization. And I'm going to try and do that within an environmental and climate justice perspective. This is going to be a big picture talk. I'm going to present to you what I consider a really important agenda that's not at all finished. And these are also challenges that I'm going to put before you. So what are we going to do today? I want to shine the spotlight on these dominant transportation modes globally that I call popular transport. They're clustered in many cities of the global south, but we also have them, by the way, in New York City, where I come from. We have commuter vans, little vans that have been, and systems created by low-income immigrant communities that don't have good bus service. But overall, we find these kinds of forms of transport in cities across the globe. Things like this minibus that you see in up top there, motorcycle taxis, little three-wheelers. And believe it or not, we don't know how many trips and how far every day these kinds of modes go, but we do know they're very dominant in many cities. And I want to suggest that by looking at these modes that have been often neglected in transport planning, we can find ways to improve them. And that could have major equity, climate, economic, public health benefits. But I want to show also that we have major data and research gaps. And so we really need to address those in order to support inclusion, improvements, equity in these cities. And there's major opportunities that exist right now. We're in a time of great technological transition, but we have some very basic tools, from digital tools that can, geolocate things, even tools that you can have on apps on your phone, to low-cost air quality monitors, which are being deployed across the globe, including in places like Columbus. So we have these major opportunities to address these data research gaps in order to think about how we can make improvements. And I want to argue that if we make these improvements, we can really address also some very deep environmental and climate justice problems globally and locally. So what's the big picture? The big picture is that we are in a historic moment of urbanization, of growing cities. I did a quick check because this is my first time in Columbus, a beautiful city, and I see that you're growing very rapidly here too, at about a rate of 1% per year. And that's a lot. You're a fast-growing city in the United States. In many places in the global South, cities are growing by 2 or 3% per year, and they're not starting with a lot of infrastructure. So what you see across the globe is just construction site after construction site, like you see here in Nairobi, where I do a lot of my work. So it's a major, major challenge. And we've had historic migrations into cities before, but we've never had this magnitude of people going into our cities. And the trends so far are not great in most of the global South. We see increasing air pollution, we see increasing crashes, we see major complaints around congestion, which gridlocks many of these cities, hampering the economic development. And increasingly, we're also seeing high vulnerability to different kinds of shocks, including climate impacts like droughts and extreme heat. So again, this is a picture of Nairobi. You can see the haze of the air pollution. You can also see along the highway a lot of the congestion. That's very typical. So we're also building these cities, looking at these trends within a moment of climate, ecological and pollution crisis. We know we need to be addressing these things while we're building our cities. And it turns out that transportation is a major contributor to all of these problems. We know that transportation as a sector is responsible for about 14 to 15% of global carbon emissions. Also, the way you do your transportation system, if you build a lot of roads into more rural or peripheral areas, you tend to get sprawl. Often that sprawl eats up agricultural land or habitats, has ecological implications, as does the air pollution. And there's even contributions to microplastics from tires of vehicles. So very big factor in our crisis. So we have to really address it. And I really want to emphasize the air pollution because we talk a lot about climate. But in the global South, where a lot of cities and countries have not contributed as heavily to our climate crisis, air pollution resonates as an issue more. And I think that may even be true in many places in the US. And transportation is a major contributor to air pollution in almost every city. I checked for Columbus, and indeed, it is one of your major sources of air pollution here. And people often don't understand the magnitude of this problem. We're talking, we don't know the exact figures, between 7 and 10 million deaths a year from air pollution, of which transport is a major contributor. And it turns out that many of the deaths from air pollution disproportionately are in cities of the global South. Now I want to come to the other issue, which is equity and justice. And this is an issue that we have not dealt with at a global scale adequately when we think about transport. We know that the global North, with our car-oriented, individual personal car model, has contributed disproportionately to carbon emissions globally. And yet, many of the cities in the global South are experiencing the climate impacts, including to their transport systems. Some budding research around this is really showing that when you get those extreme floods, you get extreme heat, you get massive disruptions of transportation systems in many global South cities. And that means people can't go to school, they can't go to work, they can't go to the hospital if they're sick. It's a very serious problem. And then, of course, at the more local levels, we have a lot of air pollution injustices in all of our cities, practically, where low-income communities tend to be disproportionately exposed to air pollution, whether in the United States, that's communities of color that are near highways, expressways, or also in the global south, where we see the same kind of phenomena. So related to transport are a lot of global to local injustice issues that I really think need to be unpacked. And while we've done a pretty good job of starting to look at that in places like the United States and at a local level, at the global level, this is just an emerging area that we need to pay attention to. I also want to propose that there's a very big opportunity here. The majority of urban residents in global south cities take some form of public transport, of which the provision is often not so great in low-income global south countries. Or, as I mentioned before, they're using some kind of shared mobility, popular transport, whether that's a kind of bus like this, or again, a motorcycle taxi, or of course, they're doing a lot of walking. Now, these are captured passengers. These are passengers that have to take these shared mobility modes, which tend to be less emitting per capita than a personal car, for example. And, you know, they're forced to do this because they can't buy a car, which is not, you know, that's a major problem. But it's also an opportunity to say, why don't we really improve these services? Why don't we really focus on that and figure out how we can integrate them into existing public transport to build really high quality multimodal public transport systems so that a person doesn't feel like they're forced to get a car if they want to move around efficiently in their city. And of course, feeling forced into having a personal mode of transportation has a high cost of, you know, resources that are not going to other things, and also contributing to the congestion, the air pollution, and the carbon problem. So basically, to quote Alex Marshall, a journalist who has written a lot about American cities, if we want to shape a city, we really have to shape the transportation system. So what we invest in will make a really huge difference in how those cities develop. But there's a bit of a puzzle that has preoccupied me for quite a long time. And that is, when you go to many planning documents and planning processes and policies in global south cities, you often see that despite the fact that popular transport is everywhere, like you see here in Nairobi, you see these little minibuses called matatus. You look at the planning documents and you see some pretty unusual things. And that is that this popular transport mode is really not present. This is like a Nairobi visioning document. And you can see that it is heavily replicating an idea of just highway-based, car-based development in cities where the vast majority of people do not have access to a personal car. I later found out, by the way, from a Chinese colleague that this was photoshopped from Beijing. And it just shows a way that some of this planning is being done top down with a visionary about a certain kind of imaginary, of a particular kind of transport system that doesn't necessarily fit what's happening in the global south. And as a result, some of what we're seeing is a lot of investment going into carbon intensive, very regressive and car-oriented dangerous infrastructure in global south cities. And that is, clear here. This is a highway that was built in between Nairobi, the center of Nairobi, and a town that's rapidly just becoming part of the metropolitan area called Thika. And you can see it was built, massive lanes, with this vision of fixing congestion for people in cars, because the planners had that imaginary. And then you start to see in this densely populated area where this highway was built, no provision made for buses, the little buses that people take, the vast majority of people, 70% of people every day take. And you also see that the pedestrian infrastructure was an oversight, like just something that was added, it was an oversight. And you can just see the congestion on those pedestrian pathways, and you see the inequity visually in this diagram. And there's also the danger of lock-in, which means once you start building for cars and you start building these highways, again, you start initiating land use changes, you initiate sprawl, and you also, often create exclusions. So people have a hard time from one side of the highway to get to the other. It's very dangerous. This is called a highway of death. And this isn't necessarily transportation that's going to get the average person to where they need to go. So there's a danger of locking in this kind of development the more you invest in it. But we are increasingly concerned about the climate crisis as a planet. And so there's a push towards decarbonization of transport, including in places like Africa and Asia. And once you start to look at decarbonization, you say, well, what do I need to decarbonize? And you start to see that in the kind of global north, we have a lot of, personal vehicles and as a kind of dominant mode. But when you start to go to places like Africa, you see the minibuses, the three-wheelers are the dominant modes. Also in Asia. So it's like, wow, we really need to, if we're gonna really deal with this, we need to start decarbonizing all of these modes. And that includes the popular transport, which is dominant. So it has become apparent that we can't keep doing the same things, that we need to start looking at these modes that have been neglected in planning. And that creates an opportunity to start asking about the kinds of improvements that we might want. And the improvements can also then lead to substantial co-benefits, potentially, if we can address improving these kinds of services, which have very serious problems. You can see they're highly polluting, so there's high exposure. They also are often old vehicles that are imported. When we upgrade our fleets, we often export used vehicles to the global south. If we can upgrade, improve, reduce emissions, then we can address some of the public health and other issues as well that are really, really severe in these systems. So there's a lot of reasons to do this. But for the long time, there's been this continued investment in like car-oriented development, as I mentioned. But more recently now, it's like, well, let's see if we can invest in bigger public transport projects like bus rapid transit, just like you have here in Columbus. You're working on a rapid bus system. That's fantastic. That's an important shift. But one of the things that is emerging is that if you just build big public transit infrastructure and you don't figure out how to connect people to their homes, all that last mile and other connectivity, then you get very low ridership. And also potentially, you're just not really dealing with a large number of trips that are being taken in popular transport. So the question is, how do we now start including popular transport in these kinds of investments in this shift? And there are many things we could do that people are starting to explore, from improving fuels, because fuel is another issue. They often have very complicated mixed fuels. We can start to think about how we electrify these vehicles. And in fact, already in places like India, the rickshaws, the three-wheelers, are electrifying way faster than any other mode. And a lot of that's happening bottom up because it becomes, in many cases, it's more economical. And so there's increasing efforts to support that. We can improve operations, the networks. We can privilege public and popular transport. There's many different ways we can upgrade infrastructure. Incredibly important now as we face extreme heat and flooding. So we can improve bus stops and exchanges and things like that. And also improve, very importantly, the training of people in these systems. They're often low-income folks who work in the sector. They work under terrible conditions, and they're generally not trained. They're self-trained. So this is another really important thing to think about. And these systems, by the way, absorb a lot of people in places that don't have jobs. So they provide a lot of employment and livelihood. And then there's a lot of places that actually are poorly served as a whole, even by popular transport, which, because it's privately provided, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, is often expensive. It doesn't often get any kind of support from the government. So there are many different ways that we can start to improve these systems. And it's quite surprising that until recently, there was a lot of resistance, because there was this idea based on this modern imaginary of the global north that somehow they'll all be replaced by, people getting cars and being on highways and roads, and maybe some buses. But the truth is they have persisted, and these cities grow, and as they grow, Manuel does some fabulous work around this, as they grow, you see that a lot of the popular transport services grow to provide service to these cities. So there's a lot of things we can do. But one of the things that we need in order to think about how can we really provide improvements and measure impacts is data. And what's quite surprising is that we know very little about many of these systems. Things are getting better. There's a lot more research by people like Professor Santana and myself and many others, but we have very little data of most of these systems in the world. So what that means is we don't know really how many vehicles, we don't know how many trips, we don't really know as much about their fuel. And when you go to these cities, you have no map, have no passenger information. We don't have information on emissions or air quality related to these systems. So we don't have planning tools. We can't model them, and there's very little accountability. We have a Sustainable Development Goal 11.2, which is really to make sure that everyone has convenient access to safe and affordable transport. But how do we measure that if we don't know, we don't have the base data for these systems? It's a really big data gap. So one of the things we can start to do is really just leverage the technologies I mentioned to you to start to map them out, to understand them better, to figure out their emissions. And if we do that, maybe we can also raise the profile of these kinds of modes that primarily serve, serve many of the majority of urban residents globally. So to do that, some of my colleagues and I got together to do this project called Digital Matatus. As I mentioned, Matatu is the little minibus in Nairobi, to prove that you could actually use very basic technology to map out these systems. It was a proof of concept kind of project. And we had a kind of theory of change, which is if we could use basic technology, ride these systems, map them out, develop some kind of standardized data, create open data for people to use, we can start to nudge the system to kind of recognize them as modes. And also start getting more folks to do research on them and how they work, and think about how to improve them, including with digital technologies, And so this is what we did with our digital Matatus project, which we did at this point, it's almost 13 years ago. And I'm just going to give you a little flavor of it. In a lot of cities, people just, there's some kind of Word document sometimes of where the routes are, like what we found in Nairobi. And it's not geospatial data. It's just where a route might be, the beginning points, some intermediate points, and the end point. I know it's hard to believe, but there are a lot of cities in the world where this is kind of maybe the kind of outdated data they have. It was very, I'm not going to say it's easy. It wasn't easy. When you look at a big city like Nairobi, it's now about 4 or 5 million people, 5 million if you take the metropolitan area. To start working with people who are providing these services and the passengers to say, wow, like where does the system go? Because it really hasn't been mapped and there's no geospatial data. So we worked with the University of Nairobi students. University of Nairobi was a core partner. And they use these minibuses to go to school and go everywhere else, partying and things. So they are very familiar with them. And we just had to start figuring out where are the nodes, where are the termini, and started mapping them out, getting lat long where they stop. And these are fairly dynamic systems, so it's, there is some, this is somewhat of an approximation. And they're very dynamic, which means routes change, so it's a slice of time. But we were showing that you could basically do that, which is how then you can use that base data to start visualizing the system as a whole and seeing these popular transport systems as a kind of public transport system for the city. So we did create, as was mentioned, the first public transit map for the city. And, this started a possibility of looking at, well, how well does the network work? One thing that happens in private systems, and you see this like with the taxis in New York City, they want to go to where they get the most profit, which is always in the center of the city. So hence you see a lot of exchanges that have to happen. So it's very inconvenient for passengers and also expensive. You have to keep going from one route to another to get across the city, for example. It's not super, in this case, super efficient. But by mapping this out, we could start to think about the network. And since we did this work, there's been more formal network analysis. So this kind of data is really important, and we need to start really generating it systematically for many different cities. I had debates with the World Bank for many years, saying they were like, we can't really do this. And then we did it. And then they started using our data when we made it open to start doing accessibility analysis. You can start to say what percentage of the population can access a park or a school, within a 30-minute ride on the bus. You can start doing these kinds of analysis. And when you do that, you do start to see in places like Nairobi that these systems provide a lot of important access to people, even if they don't always function as well as they should. You can start to talk about equity. You can look at, in this case, we did a study of health centers and looked at how many, based on mode, if you only could walk, which health centers could you access within a period of time walking? What 30 minutes walking or an hour walking, where, if you could only use a minibus, how many of these could you access? And if you could drive, you could see you could access almost all of them in the city within within an hour or 30 minutes. We did this kind of analysis. So it's a proxy for inequity. If you're poor, you definitely want to stay in the center of the city, which is actually where many of the historical poor neighborhoods are. The slums are, and they're there in part because it allows people want to stay there because they can access services. So one way to solve this is also to expand health services to generate access. And you can start measuring the Sustainable Development Goals. When you have this kind of information, you can look at inequities across neighborhoods. And one of the interesting things is that, again, in many places, these systems are not recognized. So in some of the measurements of the Sustainable Development Goal around access to transit by the World Bank, they don't look at these modes. They'll only look at, like, formal bus systems. And then you get the cities look terrible, like they're hardly meeting these goals. But when you start adding popular transport, you see how much, again, they contribute to the city. So you can start to measure some of those things. And you can start to create maps and apps for wayfinding so that people can see how to get to different parts of the city using their own popular transport systems. A lot of times it's hard to know how to get information to go somewhere. And if you have a job, interview or something, and a lot of times it's really hard to figure out how to get to a new part of your city. So that is part of accessibility, is generating very good information. And I'm sure if any of you have gone to a new city, you know that, right? You'll be like, I'll pull out my app and how do I get from here to there? We take that for granted. In most cities, that information is not available. And you can check, just go to Google Maps and see. So now I'm going to come to this idea of digital commons. This information is really important. Your city here in Columbus has this kind of standardized data, probably even real time, for your bus systems. And that helps you know, I could go and catch a bus and I don't have to wait so long. I'm assuming you have that here in Columbus. Yeah, most cities do, right? Yeah. And they probably even have it in an open format, open source, that you can go and actually play with that data and do analysis and hold them to account about, like, where's the bus going, is it leaving some communities out, and so forth. Very important. Again, because data is scarce in most of these cities, and this is such an important resource, and making it open enhances accountability and allows you to do so many things in terms of analysis and thinking about equity and quality of service. It's very important that we create a commons of this data. Just base data, not any kind of personal data, but really, how does the system work? And so given this huge problem, colleagues and a number of different important institutions, and like the World Resource Institute and the French Development Agency and others, came together out of this new kind of mapping movement and built this kind of online resource center to start sharing this data, and also sharing how to build this data for improving these transport systems globally. So we have something called the Digital Transport for Africa, which is focused mostly on Africa. But we even have some folks from other cities across other regions looking at the tools and the resources. And this is just a tiny little effort. And it's, faltering, because the question is, how do you even support this work? Because it is kind of a cooperative, data collaborative. And so it is a struggle. And yet this information is so critical for all the different reasons I outlined. Yeah, and as I mentioned, we, everything is open to really, scale this up. So I see that I'm running out of time, and I actually wanted questions. And so what I might do is just very quickly skip a few things, but just I want to emphasize that, who collects the data and how it's collected is really important. So one of the visions of all of this is that we really build capacity locally and also listen to the local knowledge of people who run these systems with this vision of really using this as a tool to improve these systems. Yeah, and based on this new data and this analysis, we're really moving towards exploring many different ways that we can improve these systems, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to just jump to the end here, since we're at time, and say that as part of another initiative, we have this partnership for research on informal and shared mobility. It's a consortium of many different partners across the global south. And our aim is really to deepen this research, share this data, and come up with really concrete, proven ways that we can improve these services. And in the end, this is really what can help us drive solutions to these major justice issues that I talked about at the beginning. So I think I'm going to leave you with this, since I've gone a little bit over time, and see if there's any questions. Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you clarify what the global south and the global north is?
Yeah, it's a very rough idea. I'm sorry, I should have said that. It's hard to have a very good way of sort of characterizing the whole globe. But there are a set of countries, like the United States, like in North America, like in Europe, high-income countries also in East Asia, that have high levels of economic development and consumption. They tend to be in the north, so we tend to call them the global north. And then there are many countries formerly colonized, often with lower economic development, primarily in the global south. And so it's a very rough term for the way that our world is somewhat divided. And of course it's not, it's somewhat crude. So I do apologize for that. I don't know if that helps.
I figured that was the case.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not perfect, right? Like there's some high-income countries in the that are technically globally south, but so it's a rough characterization. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm super interested in transportation planning, and I've been interning with a few agencies in Columbus, actually working on the Wing project that we're doing here for bus rapid transit. So talking about first mile and last mile transit, I would assume that Yeah, I assume that the top two kind of are filling a space similar to that as well. How do you see, or I guess what would be the ideal situation where you see an informal popular transportation integrated into the more formalized mass transit networks that exist in these cities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. A lot of times there is, what happens is these mass transit projects will happen, and they often don't plan for those like popular transport modes. And then the popular transport modes reorganize themselves to improve, to create some of that last mile service, right? It's kind of amazing.
So I was going to say that's, I think that is one of the shortcomings of our mass transit systems is they're slow to change. They can be very slow to change, so having that kind of dynamic reorganization, that's super cool. I was going to ask something else that I forgot.
That's okay. If it comes back, let me know. Yeah. But also, it's very important to plan for how, they sometimes call them feeder services, how those will connect. But the other thing I just want to say is that there's so little investment going into public transport compared to the need in these cities, right? These are massively growing cities, right? And there are many cities that are also smaller cities and they will never have a bus rapid transit. What they might then have is like support of upgrading and improving these little minibuses and other modes to basically work as a better system, right? And so that's why it's so important.
And then I do.
Oh, good, excellent.
Yeah, so you're kind of filling that position of almost sort of an advocate. You said like the World Bank was like, that's stupid, don't do it, it's hard.
Yeah.
And then like now they're using your data. How successful, I guess, or what progress have you made with the Nairobi government in getting them to kind of recognize these informal transportation options and kind of include that in their planning? Because I know that this transportation planning is part of one of the biggest things that we do is end up advocating for, you know, what we clearly see is right, and that people in charge are like, hey, what's that? We don't see it. You know? So.
Absolutely, that is a struggle. I mean, you know, we're advocating, but we're advocating based on real data that show, and that was the big motivation to like map out these systems to see also how they work, who are they serving, who is not served by them. Those are important questions, right? They have huge implications. Well, that's a great question. And what I'm going to say is that a couple times we tried really hard to work with the Nairobi County government. We often talked to certain engineers and planners who were very, very supportive. But there's a whole political economy around who gives out licenses. Many of the government, both the county and there's another National Transport Authority, you know, they see these systems as a way to generate revenue. So, you know, they all get licenses and things. And it's like, well, okay, we gave the license, you know, they're doing their thing. We do some form of like, okay, we'll let you be there or there. But we don't see it as a responsibility to actually improve these routes, to like get a whole like digital view of our whole system. Because in the back of their minds, for some of them, it's like, these are systems we're gonna replace. The truth is, the public transport projects in Nairobi, just like in some of our cities, often go very slow for lots of different reasons. And so that's been a struggle. But we are making progress on that in many different cities. You know, the city and the transport authorities in Addis Ababa, for example, were much more keen to have the data and think about improvements. So yeah, it's a struggle. Yeah.
You mentioned that through your analysis of when I talked to most system, it ended up being really inefficient just because everyone wants to be downtown where all the business is. Could you provide that for me with recommendations of how it would be work? And also, you don't want to like relegate some people like, oh, you only have to do this route, which is a lot less profitable for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I haven't there are researchers who are now using this data. And by the way, that data that we have needs to be radically updated. We've done a number of updates, but we really need like the city to say like, this is our job. Just like what happens in transport planning here, for example, like it's our job to do this. So there have been researchers that have looked at some of these inefficiencies in Nairobi and other cities using this data. There are some scholars now trying to figure out like, how would we do more route optimization? Very important to do that with communities, because the thing about these systems is they're very embedded in communities often. So, you know, you could have a top-down view of like an efficiency, but they might have some other reasons why they might have networks the way they have them. So it's a more involved process. But yes, I mean, one thing in Nairobi, you know, that has come up is like, how do we recreate cross-town routes? So it's, you know, maybe consolidation of some of those routes. And there has been conversation about reorganizing some of the exchanges. We've seen that in South African cities too. And of course, when you bring in some of the big public transport projects, it's also an opportunity to say, well, okay, so how are you building the multimodal system? So that's one thing we've really been pushing. You know, don't just look at the corridor, but believe it or not, it's a bit of a struggle. Because like often it's project-based, not like holistically citywide planning based. Yeah, these are great questions, by the way. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Something I kind of felt like a foundation for what we're talking about today. Please correct me if I'm wrong. This idea that like information being as widely accessible as possible helps to reduce social injustice, environmental injustice, climate injustice, and a lot of things. And the project and research you're talking about here today apply to Global South. But I was curious if you had any recommendations or resources that you know of for people in this room or throughout the United States who want to do work that relates to that foundational value of like information, data, being as open and as accessible as possible to the end of improving justice and equity within their own locality. Whether it's the process that you went through or a small version of it, less methodical version, or just resources that you know for that.
Fabulous question. So there are a lot of resources. You can find this kind of data. It's called General Transit Feed Specification data. There's a lot of different, like there's datamobility.org that has lots of these transit feeds. Most cities will make some of these, bigger cities will make these transit feeds available. And then you can overlay those with other kinds of information. Including like socioeconomic demographics. You can see like who's being served by these bus networks and how can there's been efforts to actually do some bus route reorganization, cities like Houston and others, and they've actually been able to find that they can improve services and access by doing some of that reorganization. Obviously then the need to also expand those systems. And then that becomes a budgetary issue. Are we really allocating money to ensure that people have equitable access to services? And of course, in American cities, there are demographics that are too poor to own a car. They are still relying on bus services. And this is considered a civil rights issue because many of these communities are communities of color. So it's a little more like so this is, just a huge issue. And then, as I mentioned before, being forced to buy a car, which is very important for people. It's still, there's been really good work by Nick Stein and others that, for poor folks here, like owning a car makes a huge difference. You can access so many more jobs and things, right? But that's still expensive. If you can access high quality transit and get to where you need to go, you can invest that money in your education and other things. So it's forcing people into a mode of transport. So you can start to analyze all of this by getting this kind of data and overlaying with other forms of demographic information. And these are considered like accessibility and equity and justice analyses. And there's different ways to do them. And you have some great professors here who can help you with some of that. And then there's also that kind of work with, and by the way, you can also, there's a lot of information on disadvantaged communities. There's also an environmental justice mapping tool the EPA has. So there's a lot of good geospatial data to this kind of analysis. Yeah. Back there.
Looking at your final reflections, I like the social justice line. You talked about the failure to provide access to affordable, convenient public transport. I was wondering, what's your take on? I was in New York in the spring. I was co-op there, and I spent a lot of time at Columbia University outside supporting students. How do you feel? I suppose what's your response on the one line being shut down at 116th Street?
my personal view, I clearly don't represent my university, is that that was terribly wrong. Yes. A powerful institution should not shut down public transit for its own perceived interest. I mean, I walked by there multiple times, all the time, and I did not really see a strong safety concern. So that's my personal opinion, and it's very sad. And they also shut down sidewalks and public space. Yeah. Yes.
So we were talking about like generally public transport, and so you mentioned that like, routes change. You mentioned that they're a very important part of infrastructure in the city.
Yeah.
That also means that they have like a similar look, a similar organization. So what is the like organization of it? So like are these like small corporations, groups of multiple people? Are they more like how we would understand unions? How do these drivers organize themselves and like keep
Love
a
this.
system running?
Thank you for answering that question, because I really need to clarify something. When I give these kind of very high-level talks, a lot of detail falls out. And I think it's really important to say that there's many diverse and different kinds of these systems. And they all operate a little bit differently. And even if they look the same, like a three-wheeler system in, let's say, Ghana may not operate the same way as like a three-wheeler system in India. And even across the same country, they may operate differently. They're very place-based, and so you really have to do very careful research on that. But they're sometimes just operated like by their little businesses, basically, that people create, and sometimes they get organized into cooperatives. Sometimes those cooperatives get co-opted or managed by stronger interests or bigger interests. So you have to kind of unpack that. And the relationships that these cooperatives or businesses have with the local government also vary. Some are more organized, some are less organized. So it's very place-based. So if you want to study these systems, you really have to do the kind of work that Professor Santana does, like a lot of both data mapping routes and understanding like just where they are and how they stop, where they stop and who they serve and all that, and then really talk to the drivers and the government and the users. And so that's actually something we're doing with our Partnership for Research on Informal and Shared Mobility. We call it an ecosystems approach, where we really try to understand all the different actors and what the politics and governance is. And that's actually another huge gap. Like, we really need to understand that, because what happens is a lot of times when people say, well, we've got to improve these systems, you have to start negotiating and you have to start understanding who represents these, these systems, like, and the drivers may have different ideas than the owners. Sometimes they're the same people. So there's a lot of like governance that needs to be unpacked. And that's another very big new research area that I hope more people get involved in. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay, great. These are awesome questions. You guys are awesome. Yeah.
So I kind of, in your talk so far, you kind of made I don't know if it's a clear distinction between kind of these more popular systems and
Yeah.
Systems of public transport kind of more organized systems.
Yeah.
So like run by like agencies, which we
Yeah.
kind of in your kind of research and your discussion, you kind of mentioned that you kind of go into these communities, go in with these operators and kind of things like that. I guess kind of when you go and talk to these people, I don't know if it's just more general, do they see their future as like kind of integrating into the system? Because of course from a user perspective, I don't know if there's actually a clear differentiation between the systems that are run by more informal people and systems that are run more formally. And so kind of where you're kind of like, is the future kind of lying in that sense? Do they see themselves as eventually kind of folding into these systems and systems as coexisting?
Right.
And where does that like if you're talking about like reforms and you're talking about suggestions and that's kind of going with like, do they see themselves like in terms of like fair integration or other things like that? Kind of where do they think the future lies, like in with the government or like separate from these kind of agencies? Something
I'm not going to speak for all of them. Obviously, that would be unfair and wrong. But what I would say is that a lot of them, like whether it's the rickshaw drivers in Mumbai, where we have one of our living labs, or the matatu, owners and drivers in Nairobi, they want first and foremost public recognition for all the services they provide for the city without any public investment. And so they would love to see better, like at least investment in better, infrastructure, bus stops. They, like the Mumbai rickshaw operators in one of the sites where we're working, Nalo Sopara, they pay for their own space. So Mumbai is a massive city in India. It has rail. You can go on our website and sort of get a feel for it, because my colleagues did some beautiful videos, and they had their architecture students go in and talk to all the rickshaw folks of different kinds, and they did beautiful films. So you can see what it's like. Millions of people are using the rail, and it won't work unless when they get off at their station, they can jump into a vehicle and get to their home. And around the rail stations, you also have transit-oriented development, bottom up, which is like markets. So people can go to work, come back, do their shopping, hop in a rickshaw, and get home. If they can afford it, because there's still people who cannot. Without that service, that rail doesn't really work very well in a giant city like that, where people don't all have cars. And if they all had cars and they all drove there, like, what a mess, right? So they want public recognition first and foremost, and then they want relationships with the city to be able to negotiate improvements. Where does the future go in all these different cities? I think it's clear that it's very unusual that these systems will disappear completely, even in cities that have tried very hard to do that. They still play a role in, like Bogota, for example, in Colombia. They're still there, especially in poor neighborhoods. So it's a matter of negotiation to see how can these systems work better with publicly supported systems, and maybe what can happen. Let me just quickly show you. Let me show you these. These are in South Africa. These are little minibuses that negotiated with the city. They're branded now as like city buses. And they get a little bit of support from Durban, which is the city that is doing this program. And so it's sort of starting to be like, well, we're working together and we're kind of being recognized and we're getting a little bit of support. Let's see where this goes. And South Africa's really been experimenting with this, because they invested heavily in bus rapid transit across their cities. And it's just not serving people in the townships who are historically marginalized. And so if you really care about equity after a system like apartheid that was just brutal, you need to start thinking about how do we support people in the townships to have much better transit. Some of it is BRT, some of it is improving rail, but some of it is going to be improving these services, especially if the rail or the bus or the BRT takes 10 years, right? So, yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question.
It was a very big question, and thank you very much for it.
Yeah, so it's going to depend, but public recognition, negotiation. Yeah. Yeah. So there have been efforts to basically connect different of these different popular transport modes to Uber platforms or Uber-like platforms. So you can hail a rickshaw, or there's even some companies trying to do this with minibuses. not necessarily Uber. So that there is another very interesting question about how do you, what role does this kind of technology in these specific companies play? And also this question of like, is Uber in places like Ghana drawing people out of a public transport system, or are they serving a particular kind of person? What's the equity implications? But even then, like, so my colleagues in Ghana, we have another living lab in Ghana, they're trying to figure this all out and what would be the proper regulation. But the bottom line is, yes, these companies are like engaging some of these modes. I think we saw in Dar es Salaam, he took a great picture of this, a little three-wheeler that has Uber in the back. I don't know if it seemed like maybe they were like, an Uber service, or maybe they were aspiring to it. But yeah, these platforms are starting to be used. And it's interesting to see that in some cases, small companies in these cities are building their own platforms for these popular transport modes. Very popular, rickshaw hailing going on in India. We're also working with a company in South Africa that's coming out of the townships and also trying to develop its own app and its own system that it sees as serving local people better. So there's a lot of kind of struggle around that. Yeah. They have a lot of good data. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, we're trying to get the Uber data for Accra as we speak. Yeah, and they don't share. And this is a really big problem for a digital commons, is we would love cities to really push that if some of these companies are going to operate, that they share data, because it does have a lot of value. And so that is so important, and you need to kind of build that kind of data understanding and advocacy. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yes?
So I'm curious what you have to say on intercity travel rather than intracity travel, because you focus much more on that.
Yeah.
With a lot of experience on these sort of informal systems, these popular transit systems,
Yeah.
they are still kind of prevalent as intercity
Completely.
transit as well. So as the Global South continues to develop, do you understand kind of the push to be in terms of folding these systems into intercity transit networks? To sort of my first question, or is it more that they will be kind of pushed out, eliminated in favor of rail, or just expanded sort of private transit methods?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on the city. In Kenya, there's a very, and they're not really informal. I think this is why I call them popular transport, because they pay for licenses, they're often regulated. They're not publicly supported, but they're often, they have layers of different kinds of engagement with the government. So in Kenya, there's a very well-run service of little minibuses that go between cities, and some large buses. And then also they built some new rail, very expensive, but very popular. Honestly, given how big these cities are and how they're growing, it's like, and it seems like a lot of services are needed, and giving people choice, right, is very important. You may be able to take a bus that is of better quality it's even like here, right? For a little bit more, if you can afford it, and then there's other more affordable services. I mean, that's not good for equity. You're better off having a public service that is good, that everybody pays the same and gets the same service. But, this is just a kind of a reality. So it's going to depend on the city again. I'm sorry, I really don't, I can't give you a global answer but listen, in the best of all worlds, we invest a lot more in our public transit and making it really, really good. And some of these services still play a critical role because, for example, streets are tiny, are very small in some cities, and there might be reasons why, when there's very low demand, you might want a smaller vehicle, and so there will be a role for these different kinds of services in complex, growing cities. So I think we have to be creative about thinking about how they work together. But the first step is making sure you have good information about your whole transit system. So yeah, these are amazing questions. These are really good questions. Oh, can I take another? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, sorry, I can't quite hear. Could you be just a little louder, please? Sorry, it's the, yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm just curious, how has those events impacted, if they have in any way, the process of digitizing?
Oh, yeah. So for those of you who are not familiar with Kenya, Kenya has had massive youth movements in the streets around some finance bills and other things that they're very upset about because they're imposing a lot of very high taxes on very poor people. So yeah, I mean, what often happens though, I haven't been to Kenya super recently. I was there in February, but before all this happened, so my guess though is that many of the people who run these systems are often very, very friendly to the young people because they are the people who ride them, and also they also feel they feel the pinch of some of what was proposed by the government. And so my guess is there was some, sometimes there's even collaboration. There's a very good book about Who Owns the Map, about Thailand and the motorcycle taxis playing a critical role in protest movement. That's just a aside to say that, yeah, what happens when you have disturbances is a lot of times these systems will readjust or move or change. And so when you're doing the mapping, you have to realize that some systems are more flexible and they will change their routes, and you've got to really try to capture that by continuous data collection and real-time information and things like that. Sometimes they're a little more stable and they tend to not change even when their conditions change. So, yeah. But generally, I imagine they would be some that clearly the services would be disrupted. Yeah.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Klopp for today's presentation.
And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out.